There's really nothing of my own here. It's just what Vygotsky had to say about the child development. Vygotsky saw child development as consisting of passing through a series of periods of stable development, namely infancy, early childhood, preschool age, school age and puberty. And these periods of stable development are punctuated by a series of crises at birth, ages 1, 3, 7, 13 and 17. Now, these are the stages that made sense in terms of Vygotsky's day in the 1920s in the Soviet Union. The periods are defined not by years, but by the nature of the structural transformations that happen in between these stable periods of development. For example, reflecting on the cultural determination of the stages themselves, he says, facts show that in other conditions of rearing, the crisis occurs differently. In children who go from nursery school to kindergarten, the crisis occurs differently than it does in children who go into kindergarten from the family. However, this crisis occurs in all normally preceding children. What's important is the concepts. My job is to try and give to you the concepts through which Vygotsky built his understanding of child development. I'm not trying to tell you what a 3-year-old child is like or something like that. It's down to your art and experience as psychologists and so on to bring Vygotsky's concepts to bear on children in this country at this time under these cultural conditions and so on. The fundamental character of the structures with which Vygotsky is concerned force us to consider the same basic series of transformation from birth to adulthood. But in going through each of these transitions, the outcome will always be a bit different according to conditions. The first concept which we need to get hold of here, and I've introduced this before to you, is the social situation of development. Now at this stage, I'll get my PowerPoint going. I had that bit of Vygotsky's collected works up there because, sorry, I'm still left-handed, we'll get there. Okay. Because that text, about 20 pages, which you can get to from my homepage, is what I'm drawing from. I'm just drawing from a 20-page excerpt in volume 5 of Vygotsky's collected works. I'm quoting here from page 198. At the beginning of each age period, there develops a completely original, exclusive, single, and unique relation specific to the given age. Forget that, he uses 6 words in a row to get across to us that this is unique. And one has to contemplate why he's going on so much about understanding the social situation of development is unique. Specific to the given age, between the child and reality, mainly the social reality that surrounds it. We call this relation the social situation of development at the given age. The social situation of development represents the initial moment for all dynamic changes that occur in the development during the given period. It determines wholly and completely the forms and the path along which the child will acquire ever newer personality characteristics, drawing from them, from the social reality, as from the basic source of development, the path along which the social becomes the individual. So Vygotsky conceives of the social environment in which the child finds itself and the relationship of the child to other people, not just as a collection of factors, sibling order, father's occupation, locale and so on, but or his influence, what influenced him, or the resources the family had, or anything of this kind, but concretely as a predicament. The social situation of development is a predicament. The child begins life utterly helpless. Even the cortex of the brain is unable to function sufficiently well that the child can distinguish the outline of its own body from the background. Or even, the child is unable to contribute to meeting or even determining any of its own needs. At the end of the process, If each of the periods of stable development and crises have been successfully negotiated, the child has become a fully mature member of the wider society, able to determine and meet their own needs in a manner consonant with their social position, aware of other possible social positions and taking moral responsibility for their actions, participating in the reproduction of the culture and institutions of the society. So it's about how people make that transition. And it takes a period, the form of a series of stable periods of development punctuated by crises in which the personality is totally transformed. At each successive stage in the child's development, the child becomes able to perceive that the very situation through which their vital needs are being met has ensnared them in a trap from which the child can only emancipate herself by striving in a way that stretches the capacity that they have at the given stage of development. In the case of a stable period of development, this striving brings that central function to maturity and makes the social situation of development redundant, bringing into being a new predicament. In the case of periods of crises, with its striving, the child forcibly breaks from the predicament and opens up the way directly to a new period of stable development in a new mode of behaviour and interaction. The predicament is therefore contained in the way the child's needs are being met through the adults related to the child, which lock the child into certain modes of activity which they are capable of sensing, of being aware of. At one point as a mark of respect or degree of freedom, but at another point as a limitation or even come to see as a kind of insult. The transcendence of which becomes a need and a drive in its own right. But they are not yet capable of transcending that limitation, and their efforts to do so are frustrated. The mode of activity through which the child's needs are being met is created in response, on the one side, to the expectations that the adults have of the child and the resources that are required from culture and so on, and on the other side to the child's behaviour and age, according to the child's capacities. And numerical age may be a factor, simply because the institutional norms of society are often, sometimes, tied to numerical age. As the child develops within the social situation of development, a contradiction develops. Whereas the child's needs have been satisfied up till now through the existing situation, due to the child's development, the child becomes aware of new needs which presuppose the child occupying a new role, and the corresponding change in the social situation to make that possible. The infant may be quite happy to have its mouth stuffed with food up to a point, but at a certain point they demand some control over that. Right? So they have to break out of the role where they're having their food stuffed with their mouth stuffed with food, and take up a new position. So this ability to perceive new needs does not yet mean that they're able to satisfy them, because both because they do not yet have the ability, and that the adult carers still treat them as a child, of a lower rank, and won't recognise necessarily the child's efforts and desire to live differently. So they're stuck in a situation that they have begun to see as a restriction, even though it's a situation in which their needs are being met. For example, a child might be angry and wants to defy their mother, but at that moment they simply can't overcome their own inclination, so their mother's able to manipulate them, say, "Wouldn't you like some chocolate, dear? Come on." And the child's really furious because it knows it's being manipulated, but it just can't resist the chocolate. Right? So it can get very angry. And this is a characteristic of a certain stage in development. It is this striving to take on a new role and change the situation which is what actualises development. The development can only be actualised if the adult carers respond by entering into the new mode of interaction with the child. The child perceives the situation as a constraint, strives to overcome it, and thus by implication the overcoming of these constraints falls within the child's capacity to perceive. Yeah, quite right, thank you. I have a couple of illustrations here of a child finding its current role an insult and a barrier to its fulfilling the needs the way it wants to. Parents have always been happy to bring it its dummy. It wants the dummy now. I can get it. And the sort of converse case where the child is looking forward to school, striding out confidently while its parents are quaking in their boots, the prospect of little Johnny going into that terrible school. So there's always this conflict as new situations present themselves to the child. Whatever, I'm sure the child has no idea when he's going to go through that door, but his big brother is going, so why shouldn't he? Okay. So the child must become aware, at whatever level it's sensible to speak of a child being aware of the limitations of their present position. For instance, at a certain stage, a child is simply incapable of recognising their current position as some kind of insult or restriction. They aren't simply aren't sufficiently developed. But the conditions they are in foster that development, that they can perceive their current mode of activity as a limitation and not appropriate. They can only see a certain way, in general, beyond the horizon of their current life. Right? They can't see indefinitely. They might see Dad coming in, with a shotgun over his shoulder and a moose over the other shoulder or something, but they don't really think, I should be going hunting, because they've not yet developed to see that. Right? So it's within what they can perceive. Now, what I've given you, somewhat repetitively, I confess, is an abstract definition of the social situation of development, which tells us how to approach understanding the infinity of possible relations around a child, so as to grasp concretely how the social environment determines and affords development in the child. A society only offers a finite number of distinct roles for people according to their life course. These will be different in every culture, but every society has such roles with their rights and expectations for everyone from the maternity ward to the retirement home. Okay? Each life stage constitutes a viable form of life, and corresponds to a particular set of relationships between the individual person and those around them. So growing up is passing through a series of gestalts, and the structural transformation that's required to go from one role or one gestalt to another it constitutes a crisis. Okay? So as a general concept, the driving force of development is the predicament created by the gap between a child's manifest needs and the current social means of their satisfaction. And so this way of conceiving of the social position is universal, in as much as it's presented in abstract terms, but the job, if you're interested in following Vygotsky in this, is to give it flesh and bones, make it concrete in the specific circumstances in one society or to some extent with one individual. For example, an infant might grasp for a mother's breast, but the mother may or may not respond, and the outcome will be different. Every child might do that, but the way the mother responds will depend. And so one and the same sort of universal general ideas that underlie child development can produce continually different results depending on how the interaction is concretized. For example, a child proudly turns up at school, ready to take on the new role outside the immediate care of their own family, but being unable to distance their consciousness from their behaviour and adopt an intellectual disposition, which is what Vygotsky calls that, they fail, not only fail at their schoolwork, but fare terribly in the playground. It becomes a disaster, but they get there some stage or other, and they learn to separate their immediate consciousness from their behaviour, and they learn to act strategically. And it's a precondition for being able to reflect on your own thoughts. If you simply think do, without any separation or mediation between them, you can never do any kind of metacognition. You can't reflect on how you're thinking. So precondition to entering school is that ability to create a distance. And the usual way of doing it is you throw the baby out of a nest at 5 or 6 and they go to school and they sink or swim, but mostly eventually swim, and they learn to make that separation. Right. There's one story that I've given you before, but Vygotsky gives an example of a social situation to demonstrate how one and the same circumstances bring about a different situation for each child in the family. The story is of the oldest of a woman, a single mother in fact, who becomes a drunkard, and dysfunctional as a mother, the oldest child makes a development, growing up early, if you like, and makes himself into the head of the household, not only looks after the younger children, but cares for his mother. Meanwhile, the middle child, who is very close to her mother, is quite distressed by the mother's erratic behaviour and suffers of developmental difficulty or pathology. On the other hand, the younger child was simply not she wasn't sufficiently grown up to know what was going on. So she was actually unaffected by her mother's dysfunctional behaviour. Okay, so this is to make the point that a situation is not just a set of circumstances like dysfunctional mother, but is a relationship. Okay? The situation we understand to be a relationship between the subject and its field of interaction. And that's also why I call it a gestalt, because it's a whole thing, a whole way of life, and when we talk about a way of life, it includes the person that's living it, as well as the others that make up the whole. Right? So Vygotsky is not here getting lost in an inside-outside dichotomy. Right? It's one whole gestalt. The child, in order to actualize its development, has to have the kind of cooperation of the adults around them. Right? You can't be a grown-up school kid if your parents don't let you go to school, for instance. That's off the top of my head. But you get the idea. If the parents go on treating you like a baby, like the fellow in this slide here, you can't actualize your human development. Just a second. I'll go back a little bit. Something's gone wrong there. Oh, never mind. It's a nice little slide. Don't know what happened to the 4 slides in between. Let's have an experiment for me. Oh, that's the one I should have. Okay. I want to introduce now the concept of a central neoformation. Neoformation is a funny word found occasionally in heavy medical books, or otherwise in Vygotsky. It means a psychological function here, but a new one. So in talking of a process of development, at a certain stage, a completely new formation sort of comes onto the scene. Because of the activity in the former social situation of development, which has fostered the growth of a certain formation. Yeah? So each age level of development of the child is characterised by a social situation with its specific predicament, and one neoformation above all others plays the leading role in restructuring the mental life of the child, which Vygotsky calls the central neoformation. Okay, so this is the really crux of the matter. That is not from Vygotsky, that's my own sketch to try and explain this, and I apologise for making time go from right to left if any of you are trained in the sciences, which probably are, but it just for some reason or other seemed to me that in this case the time axis had to go that way. I have no idea why. Okay, what I'm trying to show here is this rising curve there is the central neoformation. So it's illustrating the development of some psychological function. This age period is characterised by this specific function. It might be memory, it might be thinking, it might be motor coordination or something develops. So it starts off very weak, unstable, develops up to a relatively mature level. It goes on maturing for the rest of your life, but it's in this stage that it differentiates itself from other functions. So, for example, up to a certain stage, children think by remembering. The intellect doesn't function separately from the memory, but at a certain stage, the intellect distinguishes itself from a memory, and at a later time a child will remember by thinking. So what's happening there with that sharp rise is the self-differentiation of a specific function out of the whole structure of the psyche. Okay? Now, what we see at either end, this purple hump, is the transient neoformation, the transitional neoformation, and that's where the child, in desperation to break out of the trap, having reached a certain development and can in some way envisage, there's no English word for this, I don't mean really envisage like with eyes, can counterfactually intuit being different, and it will kick up, right? And it will break up that neoformation. It's a very traumatic period. It's a neoformation which by its nature cannot last. Right? When the child goes into the stage of refusing even the very things they most want to do, with a hidden objective, hidden because it's not conscious of this, it just gets frustrated that it can't direct its own activity, that it finds itself drawn hither and thither by its own desires. Right? And the mother can say, like a chocolate, or so it's like calling a dog, and the dog can't help but chase whatever it is, just can't help it. And a child who's growing to be a human being, not a dog, is frustrated by this, so the child starts refusing everything, especially the things it most wants to do. And this is very disruptive. You can't live like that. Right? But what you can do is break up the cosy arrangement that you had with your carers before, which successfully does. And the mother says, I don't know what I'm going to do with this child. I offer him his favourite pudding. He doesn't even want it. Now he's throwing things around the room, tearing up his favourite reading book, and so on. Right? So that passes away then, but it recuts, redrafts the relationships, and once the child is established, the ability to defy itself, to do what it doesn't sort of immediately want to do, then a whole new phase of development opens up for it, right? Where it's not just led along by its own desires. It has the capacity for some kind of independent thought and reflection. I'll read you out a quote. He says, these neoformations, he's talking about the I've got to make sure I know which one he's talking about. Okay. I'm just going to go back. In the case of the stable periods of development, the central neoformation gradually differentiates itself in the first phase of the period, and then in the latter phase drives the restructuring of the child's behaviour, and eventually makes the social situation of development redundant by overcoming the former constraints, generating new modes of interaction and setting up a new predicament. The central neoformation does not disappear, but continues to develop and play its part in the child's activity, but no longer plays the central driving role of development. So take note of this, that Vygotsky sees development in a very specific way, that there'll be one function within the psyche, within the child's activity, which is driving the whole process. And this is really crucial. It isn't just this function's turn to develop, but in all the myriad of different psychological functions making up the child's development, there's one that's driving the whole process. Now, there's an interesting quote from Marx talking about societies. He said there's one industry that sheds its light on all others. You know, like I think I had a fishing village up there before. Obvious what the central neoformation of that village is, all the fishing boats parked outside and so on. And of course, whether fishing succeeds or fails or the technology changes, the whole fate of the village depends on that. Whether they introduce a telephone or not, neither here nor there. Yeah? So that at a certain stage of development, there's a central neoformation which is driving the whole thing. Now, in the case of the critical periods of development, which mark the transition from one period of stable development to another, the central neoformation, which you can see at work here, forces a break from the old relationships and lays the foundation for a new social situation of development, but it is transient. In the normal course of development, it fades away and will reappear later only under extreme conditions, such as when the new situation breaks down. Vygotsky says, the most essential content of development at the critical ages consists of the appearance of neoformations which are unique and specific to a high degree. The main difference from neoformations of stable ages is that they have a transitional character. This means that in the future they will be preserved in the form, they will not be preserved in the form in which they appear at the critical period, and will not enter as a requisite component into the integral structure of the future personality. They die off. Your bolshy teenager eventually settles down, stops getting in car accidents, and behaves sensibly, right? But you know that he's his own person, and away you go. This means that the kind of negativity which children resort to during critical periods in order to break into the new relationship will fade away and generally only reappear in the event of a breakdown in the new situation. Also, during the very early phases of life, infants and their parents often manifest very advanced modes of interaction, but these are not based on cortical functions, and don't go into the development of the personality that begins a few months into life. Okay? It's a slightly different basis for a transitional neoformation. And now we'll introduce the concept of a line of development. Okay? In its development from a helpless newborn to a mature and responsible adult, the child must pass through a series of age levels, each of which constitute a viable form of social practice, a gestalt. At each point in its development, the child is able to utilise only those neoformations which have been developed so far, pulling herself up by her own bootstraps, so to speak. Each chapter in this story involves the transformation of mental life and the mode of interaction of the child from one whole viable form of life to another. Thus, at each age level, there's a central line of development, which is the story of how the central neoformation of the age differentiates itself from the psychic structure and brings about a new constellation of psychological functions. Like, for instance, you have an undifferentiated intellect memory. They separate, and then at a later stage they change positions. Okay, so it's one thing that something differentiates itself out of the whole and then develops and strengthens and stabilises, but at another stage in life where one function sort of rested on another, the whole structure can be transformed. So that's what we mean by a restructure, like the difference from remembering by thinking as opposed to thinking by remembering is a great example of that. This is quoting Vygotsky again. So I'm doing a lot of reading here because a lot of it, I have to try and get it exact for you, and I'm putting in lots of quotes so you really just get it as Vygotsky's putting it in any of my improvisations, so far as I can, when the PowerPoint allows me. Okay, lines of development we're talking about. At each given age level, we always find the central neoformation seemingly leading the whole process of development, characterising the reconstruction of the whole personality of the child on a new base. Around the basic or central neoformation of the given age are grouped all the partial neoformations pertaining to separate aspects of the child's personality, and the processes of development connected with the neoformations of preceding age level. The processes of development that are more or less directly connected with the basic neoformation we call the central lines of development of the given age. And all other partial processes and changes occurring at the given age which are called the peripheral lines of development. It is understood that processes that are central lines of development at one age will become peripheral lines of development in another. And I find this very easy to visualise in the sense of like analysing a novel, where there are different chapters of the novel that go on in a coherent story. Each chapter concerns some particular conquest or change or development, and then you follow through a novel that's at least the slightest little bit complex. The main thing, line of development of the story through that chapter, but the peripheral lines, like in the soap operas, there are peripheral lines going on at the same time, which later or reappear and play their role in the story, or perhaps follow on from an earlier stage in the story. Right? Now, I have to talk about age levels. Age levels are characterised by the specific mode of interaction which arises on the basis of the social situation, thanks to the central neoformation, which moves to the fore and matures in the given age along the central line of development for that age period. Since each of the phases of development entail biological changes in the organism, as well as institutional expectations, taking account of historical experiences of society, the age levels do implicate regular years of age, but they are defined not by age, but by the central neoformation of the age level. Okay. Just getting back to this again. The stable age levels are periods during which the growth of a central neoformation takes up a central role in development, and through its becoming a mature and continuing part of the child's psyche. In critical age period, the child forcibly breaks from the former social situation of development by a premature exercise of increasingly developed forms of willfulness manifested in forms of negativism. Okay? So that's our general schema. These forms of negativism, which rest on the child striving to develop everything, striving despite everything to overcome the frustration of their drive to do that which they cannot do, disrupt the former relations and open up conditions for a new period of stable development, in which the negativism of the critical period has to be let go. And Vygotsky says that during periods of stable development, at each given age period, development occurs in such a way that separate aspects of the child's personality change. And as a result of this, there's a reconstruction of the personality as a whole. In development, by which he means through that crisis period, in development there is just exactly the reverse. The child's personality changes as a whole in its internal structure, and the movement of each of its parts is determined by the laws of change of this whole. Okay, so in this period of gradual development, the restructuring that's going on is like the molecular changes when the particular neoformation which is driving you gradually strengthens. As it strengthens, it begins to affect and change and lead or suppress other functions in the psyche. Right? But during this critical period, the whole, it happens in a relatively short time, and the functions themselves are not going to develop in that time, other than this transitory function of negativism of some kind. But the arrangement of all the functions changes. They're connected together differently. And that swap around makes a transformation of the child's personality in a relatively short period of time. Now, what I'm going to go to now is the development of the will, or self-relation during the crisis period. And it's really, take note of the central part of the development of the will in Vygotsky's theory of child development. It ain't all just about learning. Right? The part played by the development of the will, or the child's capacity for self-determination, is central to the whole thing. Now I'm going to put up a table here somewhere, there, which is too much text just to read, but I think it's useful if somehow or other you can browse your eyes across that. Well, I'll read out line by line. At birth, the child physically separates itself from the mother and creates conditions for the front brain to begin work, through which alone social interaction is possible. When the child's in the womb, the front brain is not controlling the thing, it's subcortical functions, but a human being can't develop as a human being on the basis of subcortical function. But you get this marvellous thing in the first few minutes sometimes after birth, mother and child seem to connect with their eyes, and things that seem inexplicable. I understand it were only noticed when video cameras were introduced into observation of child development, and mothers were not believed when they claimed that they'd made eye contact with their newborn baby. But the explanation for this is that the functioning of the child there is based in subcortical areas, and it dies away. It's a transitory function. The child just doesn't go on to develop from there. The next period of critical development, after something like a year, the child's still unaware of herself as a person distinct from those around her. That's called the uvia, the primordial we. The child manifests her own will and her own personality for the first time through interaction with adults. And so the child somehow, despite everything, becomes a player. At about age 3, according to Vygotsky in his time, according to his observations, having gradually developed the consciousness of himself as a distinct person, the child separates himself from the mother psychologically by differentiation of behaviour from effect, bringing their behaviour under the control of their own will. And that's the example I've given a couple of times, that so long as the child is just a slave of their own passions, they are a slave of their mother, and they have no independence. But at a certain age, they learn to distance themselves from their desires. At age 7, having gradually expanded their radius of activity beyond the family, the child gains control over their relations with other people, the differentiation of their internal and external life, manifesting an ability to act strategically. I've had lots of arguments about exactly what they have and exactly what the strategic capacity of the small children is. It's not for me to get into that, and so working psychologists have to find out what the exact picture is in South Africa in 2011 in this or that community. But clearly, this differentiation of the internal and external life, you're not walking around like an open book. Right? The naive child at sort of 5 or 6, they walk around sort of like an open book. And what they're thinking is written over their face, generally. Okay? So they go through this change. At classes age 13, having acquired the knowledge appropriate to their social position, the child distances herself from her birthright by taking a critical stance towards it. And certainly probably one of the most widely talked about periods of critical development in a child, because it doesn't just affect the family, it affects everyone within a 20-mile radius probably. And it's absolutely crucial that a child goes through this. It doesn't have to be traumatic, it doesn't necessarily involve burning down the family house. But what a child has to do, having been brought up entirely within a certain social milieu, beliefs, ways of living, practices at home, if they are, and which party they're going to vote for when they grow up and everything else, if they're going to become a full member of society, and the society is going to be made up of independent individuals, this wonderful contradiction is that as the child goes on, it more and more differentiates itself as an individual, but at the same time that's how it socialises itself. Okay, so the child who's confronting this transition, this critical period, has a terrible disadvantage that they don't know how to argue. They can't argue against their parents because they have no factual or no basis of opinion on which to stand away from them. So you have an argument with the 14-year-old and they say, well, just because, okay, just because. Because they can't give a reason. I mean, they're arguing with themselves if they try and give reasons for rejecting some obvious fact that, you know, the ANC are rotten and, you know, we're going to, all of us people vote the other way. They're beginning to, they don't know whether that's right or wrong, but if they're going to find out, the first thing they have to do is more or less shed their upbringing. It's a very difficult and traumatic process. It's like, you know, being dropped onto a foreign planet and you know, everything you know is suddenly has to be written off. The child begins from a totally undifferentiated from their mother, physically, biologically, psychologically and socially. And the psychological functions are also undifferentiated from each other. As long as the youth does not differentiate himself from the social position, unable to take moral responsibility. It's only the process of complete differentiation that the individual can actually become a real part of their society, actually contribute to the reproduction, transformation of the culture and society. So the process is contradictory in the sense that integration into a truly human society presupposes a process of differentiation of the individual. The whole process of becoming human is driven from beginning to end by the striving of the child to overcome limitations to its self-determination and emancipate itself from the imprisonment by its own drives. The drive for emancipation proves to be the only genuinely human drive, a drive which knows no end and transcends all barriers. Thank you for that, but I'm now just going to spend a few minutes on the zone of proximal development. Okay, which is of course the most famous of Vygotsky's concepts, but I want to now put the zone of proximal development in the context of Vygotsky's writings about child development, rather than taking it in something in itself. The zone of proximal development is, as is well known, one of Vygotsky's most well-used and famous concepts. It refers to the range of psychological functions between, on the one hand, those functions which the child is able to master without assistance, and on the other hand, those functions which it can manage if given assistance. There are, of course, many things that a child can see and be aware of in some way around them, but no amount of coaching or trying will allow them to do it. So it's the range between these two limits is called the zone of proximal development. What they can do on their own, and what they can do on their own, what they can't do, and so the bottom bit, and what they can do with instruction and assistance. And it's the functions which lie between the upper limits of what they can do by themselves and what they can do with assistance, called the zone of proximal development, which sort of indicates the untapped potential of development which is already there in the child. Now, although I'm garbled in expressing it, it's really so obvious that people can't do what they're not able to do, and it's no good trying to teach them to do things that they simply can't do because of their development. That it's no good teaching kids things that they can't do even with assistance. You know? And to say that you should teach things, that teaching helps children learn, I mean the whole package is so obvious you cannot go, quoting some famous psychologist to prove this. Right? It's just a non-statement. And Vygotsky did not claim this as his own idea. I forget the name. You say he did? Or he agreed, yeah. He quotes an American psychologist. I forget the name. Okay? But let's look at this concept in the light of what we've been talking about in terms of neoformations and so on. If we know what the central line of development is at a given stage in the child's development and the identity of the central neoformation, then what conditions or modes of interaction with the child will promote that line of development and ensure its successful completion. At each level, the child's personality undergoes a reconstruction, and one function above all others is destined to play the leading role in that reconstruction. Thanks, Scott. If the instruction can bring about the development of that function, the central neoformation, then development of all other functions follows as a matter of course. On the other hand, there are always peripheral lines of development. For instance, lines of development that may have been the central formation in the previous stage, or are simply playing a secondary role to the central neoformation, not driving anything. Okay? But if they're playing a secondary role in the child's development, the child's development, meaning specifically here the preparation for the reconstruction of the child's personality. So it's clear, under these circumstances, it is the position of the central neoformation within a zone of proximal development which is crucial if the teacher is interested in assisting the child in making a development, rather than simply helping the child learn some more things. Okay? Now, it's true that in relation to let's just see if I can really be fancy and go back here. Yeah. If you're looking at this neoformation here, and you reckon you're about there, you've just been through a critical period. But actually it's quite the thing to teach the kid a few more things, to expand the vocabulary, so to speak, in that particular neoformation. Right? The child at that stage cannot see, beyond over the hill there, so to speak. So you should teach and try and stabilise that central neoformation, strengthen it, stabilise it broadly. And then if you have correctly read the child's stage of development, that development will drive everything else. It flows over into the development of other functions. On the other hand, if you're up here somewhere, then that's no good any longer. The neoformation is embedded, it's developing, and the child's beginning to sense the need to make a transformation. And they're building up to find a way out of continually being taught their tables or something, whatever is going on in there. And then the role of the teacher has to be to clear the way and assist the child in making that break. Okay? So all the things we know about the zone of proximal development, such as don't try and teach kids things that are out of their reach anyway, and don't go on teaching them things they can already do easily, right? Are really relevant in understanding of exactly what the leading activity is. What activities are going to promote the development of the central neoformation of the age, which is what's going to drive the whole process of development. Okay? Now, to do that taxes the art of the teacher and carer. You have to know where the child's at. And all the experimenting, giving the kid tests and things, and measuring that zone of development with different kinds of tasks in different circumstances is finding your way. This is locating yourself within this process of development. So there's a qualitative side to this business of a zone of proximal development. That it has to be related to the central neoformation. Instruction may lead development if and only if instruction assists the child in promoting the differentiation of the leading neoformation. Vygotsky proposed that the child can do with assistance, for example, asking leading questions, offering suggestions, or in play, allowing the child to strive to do what they actually cannot yet do today. They will be able to do tomorrow without assistance. but the desired flow over to different functions resulting from success in performing such a task will only occur if the neoformation has promoted the central or leading neoformation. Otherwise, it's sort of a waste of time. I mean, it's good the child learns anything new, but if you're hitting off the mark, saying, I can now get into multiply by 13, this is fantastic. Next week I'm going to get into multiply by 14 or 15. Just promoting a function because there's still room for development doesn't necessarily make any sense. In fact, is likely to aggravate the situation and you're going to have an explosion of time. So I'm sick of this bloody times table. I know my times table. Basically saying, excuse me, I've hit a critical period. Can we reorganise things here, please? Yeah? I'm not a teacher, so I wouldn't suggest what action to take at that point except to run for cover. Yeah? So I'm sorry it's been somewhat clumsily delivered here because I really had to take care in the way I've presented this concept. I've done a lot of reading, but I hope that's useful to you. I've also got here far too much text to talk over, but that's the first few periods, and I'll change to the next set after that if you want to browse over. And again, I'm taking this from Vygotsky. It's not my opinion of what they go through, but it's Vygotsky's opinion as per late 1930s Soviet Union. Right? There's no reason to suppose it'll work just the same now. The institutional conditions in which children grow up and the way the parents relate to their children profoundly affects the way these stages go through. And basically everyone has to get from the womb to the grave and passing through, being a respectable citizen, effective citizen in between somewhere. And so all these things have to happen. It has to separate your memory from your intellect. You have to get your hand-eye coordination working. You have to develop a will that's capable of not just allowing you to be dragged along by your own desires, but that they will happen differently. But the main thing is you get you borrow from Vygotsky these concepts of development happening by escaping from the track. The track made by the way your needs being met. Okay? Which develop another need which requires that form of meeting your needs to be overthrown. The idea of gradual periods of development and transient, critical periods of development, separate them. The idea of the contrast between the development of the parts bringing about a gradual change in the whole. Like when one particular industry, which was minor in a country, just keeps on growing and growing and growing, and all of a sudden you sort of realise it's restructuring the whole way the whole economy works, right? As opposed to an overthrow of the entire thing and everything's turned upside down. And the difference between those two types of change, and the difference between the peripheral line of development and the central line of development. Vygotsky not only the illusion that only one thing's developing at a time. I mean, the brilliance of this is how out of this enormously complex process of development where all different things are going on at the same time, he's able to abstract which is the line of development which is driving the show. I'm sure spending a lot of time with kids. And to fit the idea of a zone of proximal development into that picture, right? That in a certain point the child doesn't need to learn some new thing you can help them with. Actually what they need is to learn to do things on their own and not need supervision all the time. Yeah? And so what you may need at that time is the opposite of assisting the child, is to withdraw support, saying, no, it's time you made your own bed, off you go. Yeah? To distinguish between to be able to pick out the critical periods, which are firstly are totally restructuring the child's whole personality and necessarily involve negativism, right? Being difficult, and the form of the difficulty changes as different types of transition, but I think it helps survival of the parent, if nothing else, to understand what's going on. Yeah? Okay, that will do.